It was July of 1944, and the Pacific was less an ocean and more a colossal humid furnace where young men were forged into steel or reduced to ash. On the island of Saipan, beneath a sun that felt less like a source of light and more like an incandescent, vengeful eye, the United States 27th Infantry Division was being bled dry, every inch of volcanic soil contested with a ferocity that defied all logic and human endurance. The air itself was a soup of pulverized, coral-stale gunpowder, the metallic tang of blood, and the sickly sweet odor of decay, a suffocating atmosphere that coated the throat and left a permanent, bitter residue on the soul. The men were operating on pure instinct bodies, driven by a will long divorced from any rational calculation, struggling through terrain that ripped uniforms, tore skin, and hid death behind every impenetrable tangle of vegetation. A truly demonic landscape, designed by an indifferent nature to amplify the horrors of war, where the only certainty was the closeness of a brutal, unforgiving end. Sergeant Thomas A. Baker, a man from Troy, New York, but who now belonged entirely to the inferno of the Marianas, knew the precise moment the war had decided it was finished with him. He was a veteran of the kind that moved through fire with the grim professionalism of an undertaker, efficient and deadly. But even the best men break, and the shrapnel that had torn through his abdomen had done its work with surgical finality, twisting him into a shape that no longer belonged on a firing line. The pain was not a feeling, but a vast, all-consuming entity, a roaring red tide that washed out sight and thought, leaving only the ragged, desperate sound of his own breath. His primary weapon, a trusted M1 Garand, lay uselessly beyond his grasp, its familiar lines now mocking him with its distance, while his uniform felt like a soaking sponge of his own, leaking lifeblood heavy and cloying. He was a wreck, an absolute ruin, incapable of walking, incapable of fighting. And worse, he knew he was now a liability, a dead weight his surviving comrades would have to drag through the imminent wave of the enemy. He spat out a mouthful of bile and dust, the gritty taste a bitter confirmation of his fate. And when his lieutenant appeared, face a mask of exhaustion and impossible decisions. Baker didn't ask for help. He gave an order, the final command of a man determined to control his own ending. "Leave me." He rasped the words, scratching out of a throat drier than the sand. "I can't slow you down, not now." He insisted with a terrifying calm that chilled the young officer far more than any panicked plea that they prop him up against the trunk of a broad, scorched banyan tree, the dense, rough wood offering the only solid, unmoving presence in his rapidly disintegrating world. They hesitated, of course, because men do not abandon their brothers in the heat of battle. But Baker's eyes, already half lidded with approaching shadow, held a conviction that brooked no argument, a plea for functional death over useless, lingering survival. They left him reluctantly disappearing back into the sound and fury of the advance, and he was alone, a piece of broken machinery discarded in the jungle's bloody maw, his fate sealed not by a lack of courage, but by a physical wound he could not overcome. In the sudden, strange lull that followed, a detachment of Imperial Japanese soldiers, seasoned veterans of the Emperor's inexorable fight, swept through the clearing on a flanking maneuver. They were silent, driven, focused on the living threats ahead, yet their eyes, sharp and predatory, caught the sight of the slumped American. Sergeant Baker, leaning against the banyan, his flak vest ruined, and his chest rising and falling in shallow, agonizing rhythm, was a tableau of defeat. The Japanese paused their movement, becoming a still dangerous moment of assessment, and they did not rush him with bayonets, nor did they waste a round of ammunition on him. Instead, they offered him a far more profound, corrosive violation, a look of utter dismissive contempt. They saw the blood, the shattered posture, the absence of a proper rifle, and they saw what was clutched almost petulantly in his failing hand, a sidearm, a small, dark shape that seemed ridiculous against the vast backdrop of jungle warfare. They did not even bother to raise their weapons, their silence thicker and heavier than any shout, merely exchanging curt, low-spoken phrases in their native tongue, a sound that carried the weight of a laugh. This man, they implicitly stated with their eyes and their lack of haste, was a corpse already, a defeated, weak foreign dog whose insignificant little toy of a weapon was an insult to the art of war. The insult was not a bullet, but the chilling certainty that he was utterly beneath their notice, a dying failure, whose pathetic existence would be terminated later, perhaps by a junior man simply to clear the field. Baker, staring up from the abyss of his own pain, registered that look, that crushing, total rejection of his worth as a soldier, and a small, quiet, murderous fire began to burn in the depths of his consciousness, a rage that offered the last, purest form of energy he had left. The little toy that drew the Japanese scorn was the final hard truth of his situation, a solid piece of American ingenuity that had been carried in the hip holster of United States soldiers for over 3 decades, the Colt model, 1911. A one variation. It was the absolute antithesis of the long-range precision-killing machine. The war required a weapon designed for desperate close quarters, fighting for the final bloody intimacy of a hand-to-hand struggle, a tool of last resort, and nothing more. It was chunky, heavy, and unforgiving, a piece of machinery that tolerated no softness in its user, demanding absolute grip and focus to manage the punishing recoil of its round. The ammunition it fired, the famous .45 automatic Colt pistol or ACP round, was a philosophical statement in and of itself. It was slow by rifle standards, an immense blunt piece of copper-jacketed lead, traveling at barely 800 feet per second, but its diameter was enormous, a crushing, debilitating blow that traded velocity for sheer stopping power, designed to instantly drop a man and utterly destroy his will to fight. Baker had 8 of these brutal rounds loaded into the single magazine, a meager handful of metal against the 16 or so shadows that had just dismissed him. 8 rounds, not a belt of machine gun fire, not a full clip for a Browning automatic rifle, but 8 chances to buy back his honor, 8 moments to make the passing squad regret their contemptuous pause. The mechanism of the pistol was known to him as intimately as the geography of his own hand, every spring, and pin a familiar, trusted component. He felt the cold, hard serrations of the slide beneath his thumb, confirming the round was chambered, a physical certainty in a world gone abstract with pain. This weapon was simple, robust, a design perfected by Mr. John Browning for the Philippine insurrection, built to stop the most determined charge. And now it was Sergeant Baker's sole remaining treaty with existence. He pressed his back harder against the rough bark of the banyan, finding a tiny niche that focused his weight and momentarily stabilized the tremor in his hands, allowing the pistol to settle into the familiar, heavy weight of a deadly purpose. His mind, sharpened by the searing agony in his gut, was suddenly unnaturally clear, functioning with the cold, logical precision of a well-oiled machine gun. The scornful laughter, the quick, dismissive glances, they were tactical gifts, an arrogant overconfidence that the enemy would pay for in blood. He was no longer Sergeant Thomas Baker, an infantryman fighting for a position. He was now a geological feature, an unmoving, inconspicuous rock in the tide, armed with a short-barreled shotgun in a pistol form. The 9mm rounds, favored by some of his Allied counterparts, were considered fast and clean, designed for rapid incapacitation. But the .45 was different. It was meant to tear a hole to stop a body completely, to put down the charging element with extreme prejudice and immediate effect, a kinetic promise of terminal certainty. Baker had always appreciated that finality understanding in the close, miserable fighting of the jungle, that a man who could still twitch was a man who could still kill, and the .45 was a promise that there would be no twitching. He checked the magazine, feeling the subtle click that confirmed the 8 rounds were seated properly. His entire operational plan now reduced to 8 pulls of a trigger, 8 violent, decisive moments that must achieve total, overwhelming success. The sheer loneliness of his action was a burden that few men ever had to carry, a complete and total withdrawal from the shared protective insanity of the squad. He had rejected evacuation, and in doing so, he had, in effect, signed his own death warrant, choosing the banyan tree as his final desolate foxhole, his tombstone, and his final command post. The only things that mattered now were the angle of fire, the geometry of the approaching threat, and the finite resources of his 8-round magazine. He would have to make every shot count, not just as a hit, but as a fight stopper, relying on the immense kinetic energy of the heavy slug to do its dreadful work instantly. The Japanese patrol had moved on, but he knew they would cycle back, perhaps using this apparently quiet, cleared sector as a safe zone for their regrouping, or as a shortcut back to their lines. The silence that had descended was not peace. It was the tense, coiled silence of a trigger mechanism moments before the hammer falls. Baker breathed in slowly, the effort a monumental task that sent fresh waves of blinding pain through him, and then he let the breath out, allowing the pain to become part of the background noise, a static hum against the crystal-clear calculation of his last stand. The Colt, heavy and comforting, was now merely an extension of his will. 8 ounces of fury waiting for the 16 shadows to return to the clearing. He waited, a dying man, a forgotten warrior, who was about to give the enemy a brutal, shocking lesson in the difference between a sidearm and a principle. The sun beat down, turning his sweat and blood into a thick, sticky residue, sealing him to the tree, transforming him from a wounded soldier into a patient, immovable predator. The subsequent hours were a purgatory of heat agony and the ceaseless, distant cacophony of Saipan's ongoing battle. Baker did not move, did not shift, conserving every precious particle of life he had left, allowing the raw, tearing pain in his abdomen to dull into a constant, crushing pressure, an omnipresent dullness that was almost worse than the sharp peaks of initial injury. He trained his eyes on the narrow trail the Japanese squad had taken, measuring the distances in his mind, calculating the precise point where the .45's drop-off would become negligible, ensuring that every projectile launched would strike with its full intended force, a cold study in terminal ballistics. The smell of the jungle, the moist earth and decaying leaves, was being slowly replaced by the acrid metallic stench of his own infection, and the heavy, sweet smell of his drying blood, the odor of a dying engine. It was a sensory isolation chamber, forcing his attention inward, refining his focus until the only reality was the front sight of the pistol and the 8 bullets resting below it, each a golden, terrible promise. He had mentally rehearsed the engagement 100 times, timing the shots, prioritizing the targets. The men with the map, the men with the submachine guns. The man who had laughed, seeing the sequence of fire unfold in his mind's eye, with the cold, detached clarity of an accountant balancing a deadly ledger. He knew they would return, drawn by the perceived safety of the route, and he was ready to leverage their arrogance against them, a final, beautiful act of terminal defiance that would redeem the initial humiliating glance. The thirst, a brutal physical craving that clawed at his throat, was just another distraction to be ruthlessly filed away and ignored, a minor administrative detail in the vast final operation that was his last stand. He was utterly alone, but in that isolation he achieved a state of tactical purity, a zero-defect mindset, where the world narrowed to the 4-inch barrel of the Colt and the 5 senses required to wield it. He was a tripwire waiting for the precise, inevitable pressure of the enemy's careless boot. His comrades, meanwhile fighting just 300 yards away, felt his absence like a missing tooth, a raw, aching vulnerability in their line. The lieutenant, Mr. Thompson, hadn't told the others the whole truth, only that Sergeant Baker had been grievously wounded and could not be moved, omitting the part where Baker had chosen his death spot, painting a picture of resignation rather than defiance. The men fought with a silent, heightened intensity, fueled by the unspoken knowledge that one of their best was gone, a phantom presence whose absence made the perimeter feel fragile and exposed. They were taking fire from the ridge line, a desperate, disorganized Japanese counterattack that was more of a collective banzai charge than a tactical maneuver, but they held the line, the metallic stutter of their air-cooled machine guns, providing a continuous, grinding defense. For them, the sergeant was already a casualty, a name to be added to the tally. Yet for Baker, leaning back against the banyan, the battle was just beginning, a highly personal, intensely focused war of attrition, reduced to a single man, 8 bullets, and the memory of a scornful glance. He was fighting not for the line, not for the objective, but purely for the restoration of his own professional dignity, a final bloody payment for the contempt he had been shown, determined to prove that even a dying American sergeant was a force of absolute terror. The jungle finally delivered its prey. It was not a grand sweep, but a slow, cautious return. The same Japanese squad, their mission complete, now moving back to consolidate their conversation low and relaxed, punctuated by the rhythmic swing of their Arisaka rifles. They were supremely confident, their bodies showing the easy exhaustion of men who believed themselves to be out of the immediate danger zone. Their pace measured, and their posture loose, their minds already anticipating the small comforts of the rear lines. They followed the narrow, barely visible trail slipping between the thickets, and then they entered the clearing, a group of about 16 men, their rifles slung or held loosely. Their eyes flicked toward the banyan tree, expecting to see a mess, a stiffened corpse, perhaps a relic to be looted or desecrated, and maybe they would assign one of the younger privates to the gruesome chore. And there he was, Sergeant Baker, exactly where they had left him, a pool of dark, dried blood staining the ground beneath him, an object of silent, confirmed victory. But this time, something was profoundly, terrifyingly different. This time, the eyes that looked back at them were not the dull, receding eyes of a dying man, but the cold, focused lenses of a machine that had just achieved perfect operational readiness, a weapon zeroed in on their center of mass. The moment of recognition, the microsecond of realization that the seemingly defeated enemy was now perfectly aimed and entirely alive, was the only warning they received. It was a failure of the tactical imagination, a catastrophic oversight born of hubris. Baker did not shout, did not hesitate, did not allow them the fraction of a second needed to raise their own rifles. His movements were small, precise, and utterly final, minimizing the physical expenditure while maximizing the lethal output. His hand, steady as stone, despite the devastation raging in his body, shifted the Colt, aligning the front sight post with the center mass of the nearest officer, a man who still had the faint, dismissive sneer lingering on his face. The sound of the .45 ACP round was not a crack, like a rifle, but a dull, concussive thump, a heavy, deep shock wave that seemed to punch the air before it, the signature sound of immense, slow-moving kinetic energy being violently transferred. The officer collapsed instantly, the massive slug hitting his sternum with the force of a hydraulic ram, disrupting his heart rhythm and throwing him backward into the man behind him, a chaotic domino effect designed to break their formation and shatter their morale. The sound of the first shot cut the silence like a razor, stripping away the Japanese squad's complacency and instantly plunging the clearing into absolute violent chaos, replacing contempt with paralyzing primal fear. Baker was firing deliberately, slowly maximizing the impact of every pull, the dense, acrid smell of burning cordite momentarily overwhelming the humid jungle air. Thump, thump, thump. He was not painting a canvas. He was systematically erasing a list, allowing the heavy recoil to travel through his forearm and into the solid base of the banyan tree, the wood acting as his silent, unmoving bipod, absorbing the violence he could not. The first 4 men were dropped in a blinding sequence, the heavy slugs shattering bone, rupturing vital organs, and destroying central nervous systems, turning living, fighting soldiers into inert sacks of meat before they could even locate the source of the attack, the lethality of the .45 caliber round proving its long-established reputation for terminal cruelty. The Japanese troops, startled and disoriented by the seemingly impossible attack from a man they had written off dove for cover, scrambling behind rocks and tree roots, their discipline momentarily shattered by the sheer shock of the betrayal. They were looking for a machine gun nest, a hidden rifleman, not the source of the fire that was emanating from the slumped figure beneath the banyan. The muzzle flash of the Colt, brief and violent, was their only clue, and already Baker had taken out 4 of them, using half of his total available ammunition, a terrifying demonstration of efficiency. He waited the heat of the smoking barrel warming his already feverish palm, counting the seconds, measuring the depth of their confusion, allowing their fear to blossom into full panic. The pain in his stomach was now a high-pitched, screaming wire, but he ignored it, channeling the agony into a deep, unwavering stillness, focusing only on the subtle shifts in the dirt and leaves. The remaining Japanese soldiers, recovering their professional reflexes, began to return fire, not at a target, but at the perceived location of the target, spraying the area around the banyan with the thin, high-velocity rounds of their Arisaka rifles. The air hissed as bullets whizzed past, tearing bark and kicking up clouds of dirt. But Baker was low protected by the density of the tree trunk and the sheer audacity of his position. He saw a man rise, attempting to flank him through a thicket of ferns, a movement that betrayed the soldier's position, and intent a desperate attempt to break the stalemate. Thump. The 5th round aimed slightly lower to account for the angle, and the target's forward motion struck the man in the thigh, ripping through the flesh and bone, spinning him around with a terrible cry of shock and pain. The leg buckled instantly, the heavy round doing its work by destroying the man's structural integrity. He was neutralized, still a threat, but no longer capable of coordinated movement or effective fighting, a broken clock in the machinery of war. Baker shifted his focus, his gaze tracking the movement of a 6th man, emboldened by the covering fire, who started to crawl rapidly towards a shallow depression that would have given him a clear, protected field of fire onto the sergeant's exposed position. Baker tracked the movement with cold precision, knowing this was the decisive moment, the last chance the enemy had to mount an organized threat. He did not aim for the head or the chest, knowing the difficulty of a moving target. Instead, he fired his 6th round into the man's outstretched arm, the limb that was clutching the rifle, aiming to destroy the instrument of war. The .45 hit with the predictable destructive force of a small hand grenade, tearing the rifle from the soldier's grip, replacing his professional fighting ability with instantaneous, paralyzing agony, a purely tactical shot. 6 rounds. 6 men neutralized or killed outright, the cost-benefit analysis of the Colt's ammunition, proving terrifyingly efficient. He had 2 bullets, left 2 final pieces of cold steel to conclude this intensely personal engagement. The chaos subsided once more, replaced by a tense, heavy silence, punctuated only by the shallow, ragged breathing of the wounded, the soft drip of blood onto the coral, and the distant roar of the main battle. The surviving Japanese soldiers, now realizing the source of the deadly fire was the American they had despised, were terrified, their cultural certainty shattered by this ghost of a warrior. They were facing not a unit, but a phantom, a dying man who had turned his final moments into an industrial-grade killing spree, a nightmare resurrected by their own arrogance. Two men, thinking the crippled American was now empty, made a coordinated dash for cover, hoping to reach a larger cluster of rocks, believing the odds were now in their favor. Baker, with his 7th round, dropped one instantly, a clean final shot to the head that spun the helmet off the soldier's skull and left him motionless on the coral dust, a perfect example of controlled single-shot lethality. Now he had only one bullet remaining, a single point, 45 ACP round in the chamber, the weight of the entire universe, the entirety of his 8-round plan resting on its tip. The final living Japanese soldier, a non-commissioned officer, was paralyzed by fear and rage, hugging the earth, trapped by the deadly efficiency of the seemingly unarmed man. His mind, struggling to reconcile the reality of the massacre with the pathetic figure he had seen moments ago. He saw the empty holster, the minimal ammunition pouches, and he knew logically the American must be out of fire. He screamed a short, guttural command in Japanese, a sound of frustrated, desperate fury, and began to rise rifle first, intent on ending the humiliation and restoring honor to his lost squad. Sergeant Baker, feeling the pain in his body intensify to a point of near blackout, smiled a grim, terrible smile, the final terrifying exertion costing him everything. He lifted the Colt one last time, ignoring the searing heat of the metal and the agony that felt like fire tearing through his torso. He held the trigger for a deliberate, agonizing second, allowing the Japanese soldier to fully commit to his charge, ensuring the target was large, moving, and unstoppable. Thump. The 8th final and most important round of the magazine was fired with absolute certainty, the massive slug traveling the short distance with terminal purpose. The heavy, brutal bullet found its mark in the Japanese sergeant's chest, dropping him in mid-stride, his forward momentum carrying his lifeless body a few feet before it settled. The clearing fell utterly silent, only the distant rolling thunder of the war remaining, and the low, heavy breathing of Sergeant Baker. The scorn had been paid for not with one life, but with the utter destruction of a unit, a final bloody testament to the dignity of a warrior who refused to be dismissed. The empty Colt, still clutched in his hand, was now an inert piece of hot, useless steel, its purpose fulfilled. The statistical outcome of that small, forgotten engagement was nothing short of miraculous, a cold, hard fact of the Saipan campaign that defied all logistical and physical constraints. The Japanese squad, numbering around 16 men, was annihilated or incapacitated by the concentrated, hyper-efficient fire of a single mortally wounded man using only a sidearm, the sheer dense collection of bodies around the base of the banyan tree, testifying to the impossible event. Sergeant Baker's comrades, pushing forward after repelling the main counterattack, eventually reached the clearing and found the appalling scene: the bodies of 10 Japanese soldiers killed, outright, the rest wounded, screaming, or broken, all surrounding the silent, slumped figure beneath the banyan. The United States soldiers did not speak. They simply stared at the impossible physics of the situation, the small, empty Colt pistol, and the mass destruction it had unleashed, the silence of the American infantrymen speaking louder than any shocked expletive. Baker was still alive, barely his breathing now, a faint, shallow whisper, his face drained of all color, but holding a final, terrifying repose, the grim satisfaction of a mission completed against all odds. They retrieved him immediately, rushing him back through the lines, carrying him on a makeshift stretcher, back to the rear area for emergency medical attention. The Lieutenant Mr. Thompson personally supervising the evacuation, his face pale with the realization of the incredible feat he had just witnessed. The medics worked feverishly in the suffocating heat of the tent, their efforts hampered by the immense damage caused by the initial shrapnel and the hours Baker had spent without care. However, the wounds, deep and catastrophic, were beyond the limits of battlefield medicine and human endurance, a final undeniable toll exacted by the war. Sergeant Thomas A. Baker died shortly after being evacuated, a casualty of the battle that he had in his own small private war decisively won. His story was immediately collected by multiple eyewitness accounts, men who described the scene with an almost reverent awe, leading to the swift recommendation for the highest form of military recognition. The ensuing paperwork, the testimony of the surviving soldiers, and the grim evidence of the clearing itself painted a clear, undeniable picture of valor that transcended mere courage. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor, and it was ultimately presented posthumously for his actions during that terrible period, a recognition of his impossible courage and selfless sacrifice. The citation itself struggles to capture the sheer technical and psychological perfection of his final act, describing his determination and deadly accuracy, but failing to convey the profound truth that he had chosen the specific terms of his death to maximize the enemy's casualties, trading his remaining moments of life for a focused storm of 8.45 caliber rounds. He died alone, having made the solitary, terrifying choice to use his death as a weapon, refusing to let his physical demise become an emotional burden on his team, ensuring that his final position was the most costly piece of ground the enemy would ever step on. Sergeant Baker's ultimate legacy is not merely the statistics of the Japanese squad he destroyed, but the philosophical statement he made that a soldier's worth is measured not by the size of his weapon or the health of his body, but by the ferocity of his spirit and the depth of his commitment. He took a piece of equipment designed for close-range defense, a sidearm often carried as a comfort more than a true weapon, and transformed it into a devastating offensive instrument, a perfect tool for exacting vengeance against the scorn he had endured, converting a physical weakness into a tactical strength. He proved that 8 rounds fired with perfect purpose by a dying man could hold more lethal power than the full clip of a rifle fired by 1,000 men without conviction. His was the quiet, brutal victory of the underdog, the last laugh of a man who chose his own battlefield and dictated the terms of his own final fight, a man who, in the face of death, achieved a tactical and spiritual apotheosis. The war in the Pacific would continue an endless grinding meat grinder, but for one sergeant beneath a banyan tree on Saipan, the ledger was balanced, the insult was repaid, and the line was impossibly held. His final moments were a testament to the fact that true military courage is often found not in the charge, but in the decision to stand immovable against the overwhelming dark, armed with nothing more than certainty and a single, heavy, beautiful Colt model, 1911. A one forever sealing his place in the bloody unwritten history of the Pacific Campaign. The ghost of Sergeant Baker, the silent guardian with the .45, remains one of the greatest, most terrifying tales ever told among the veterans of the 27th Division, a grim reminder that the most dangerous man on the battlefield is the one who has absolutely nothing left to lose.